Welcome to the Girlfriend God Podcast, a podcast in search of and in service to the divine feminine, bringing you an equal mix of academic research and emotional spiritual experience. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and leave a comment. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with your friends, rate and review it if you're listening on a streaming platform. Follow on social media on TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook. Now, let's get in the flow. Welcome to the Girlfriend God. Today, I am happy to welcome Ronna Detrick. Ronna left the church and its dogma nearly 20 years ago, but she took the stories of women with her. She combines her love of writing with a Master of Divinity degree and a career that has included coaching, spiritual direction, professional development training, corporate leadership, and entrepreneurship. She shocked and delighted her audience in a provocative TEDx presentation on an Eve who inspires and empowers women instead of shaming and silencing them. After living most of her life in the Pacific Northwest, she is now just minutes from the Atlantic Ocean in Hampstead, North Carolina, where she continues to write, drink strong coffee, have beautiful conversations with her clients, and cannot be dissuaded from the belief that her two daughters are the most amazing humans on the planet. Ronna, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kelly.
So your book, Rewriting Eve, Claiming Women's Sacred Stories as Our Own, just came out earlier this month. And when I was getting ready for this conversation, I kept thinking about, so one of my favorite lines from one of my favorite songs is by an artist named Ellen Rosner, and the name of the song is Jericho. So she managed to take the story of Jericho and turn it into a lesbian love song, which is awesome in and of itself.
Awesome.
But she has this line in the song, and the line is, "It's time to rewrite the books, rip out some pages, and rewrite another one." So that kept kind of ringing in my head when I was getting ready for this morning. So since I haven't read the book yet, do you want to talk a little bit and kind of promo your book a little bit, since you have the opportunity to do that? And then I'll ask you some questions and we'll go from there.
That sounds great. Thank you. The book is probably 20 years in the making. I've been working on these stories, trying to think about how to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. How do I walk away from the doctrine and the dogma and the beliefs from growing up in the church that are practically at DNA level? How do I walk away from all of that, deconstruct that, step into new ways of being in the world, but not have to leave behind stories of women that feel to me like they've always been ignored, always been shamed, always been silenced. And so for me to just walk away from them perpetuates that in a lot of ways.
Right.
And so what I really wanted to be able to do, first for myself, and then I began doing this for other people, and I've been writing all along, is to think about these stories through the lens of the woman herself. And I think we can probably agree that this whole biblical text is and always has been subjective. This idea that it's, this pen, that hand that's been directed by God kind of thing is bullshit.
Not so.
And so the stories have always been told through the lens of the teller. And for generations and centuries, the only tellers have been men.
Right.
And so what I started to play with early on when I was in seminary and then ongoing was, well, what happens if we subjectively tell this story through the lens of the woman? Right. I have just as much permission to imagine this story the way that I want to, just as it has been all along.
Right.
And so I started doing that, and what I discovered along the way was a number of things. One was that I couldn't find a ton of other women doing this. Feminist theologians, to be sure,
Right.
womanist theologians, liberation theologians, they were doing this work and had been for a very long time in a beautiful and powerful way. And if you are not one to read academic works, it's really hard to find them in the first place and to get through them. They're very meaty and
Right.
tough and
Right.
beautiful. They're just
Right.
not what we would just sit down and read over with a
Right.
cup of tea.
That's something we're going to be addressing in season 3,
Mm,
because
mm,
that came up a lot in season 2, is how do we bridge that gap
yes,
between
academia and
the spiritual academics and your average seeker whose only research tools are Google and Amazon, you
exactly,
know.
exactly. So that was one of the things I discovered was that I couldn't find a ton of
Right.
writing or voices that were reimagining these stories.
Mhm.
Even it was shocking actually when I started doing the research. Like I could find women who were reinterpreting the stories or retelling the stories, but just as badly as they've always been told, still full of shame and full of contempt and
Right.
full of ideals about what the perfect woman would be on behalf of her husband or in relationship with God or whatever. And I'm like, ugh, I don't want any of that.
Right.
So initially, this was just kind of an experiment for me to see what would happen internally if I played with these stories. And what I discovered personally was that let's take Eve as an example, the more that I began to understand her not bound up in shame, not being the person who was responsible for the downfall of all creation, not the one who has cast us all into the pit of hell, is that I began to see myself differently. I
Right.
started looking at these themes that were so deeply embedded in my understanding of self as being the person who brings about disaster, can't trust my own curiosity or wisdom. When I make choices on my own behalf, of course, it's going to cause destruction everywhere I look. Like we grow up like believing this somehow, even if we've not been taught it blatantly. So to retell her story began to untangle some of those knots for me. And it changed the way that I lived in my own story and understood it. And then, of course, I've done many, many stories since then. The book
Right.
holds 10. I've chosen 10 women out of this larger text. There are way more than 10, but I had to stop somewhere. So I picked 10 and I've reimagined all of them and invite ways of letting them become really profound muses and mentors and active and actually a presence for us to rely on and lean on and talk to and love and be loved by.
Right. So one of the things that I was going to ask you was, so first of all, we did there was an episode in this season that I would encourage you to listen to. Myself and Monette, who
I did
introduced
listen to that
us.
one. Yes.
Oh, and Carla with
With Lilith and Eve, you talked about.
right. And Monette
Mm-hmm.
said, we really kind of threw Eve under the bus, and
Mm-hmm.
none of us had ever really looked at it that way
Mm-hmm.
before. And the first question that came to mind was, sorry, there's a bit of a barking cacophony happening in the
All
other
good.
in the other part of the house, which, inevitably, whenever I record, some sort of big delivery truck shows up immediately.
Of course.
Of course.
To be expected.
Right. Right. I might as well just make a recording because it happens every time. Um, excuse me for just a second.
Okay.
So the first question that I was thinking about was, so when we did our episode on the Virgin Mary and all the mythology that went into the Virgin Mary, one of the things that I discovered was that there was in the research that I did, you could really narrow down the demonization of Mary to one person, which was Pope Gregory, right? He essentially created the mythology of both Mother Mary and, painted Mother Mary as, the virginal perfection, and Mary Magdalene as the repentant prostitute. So I wonder if there was a singular person who was responsible for painting Eve as, as that. Like, who created that particular story that she was responsible for, pretty much the fall of all of us.
Yeah. I mean, if you listen to my TED Talk, you hear me go through this kind of litany through history, through time.
Right.
So the earliest quote that I use, I think, in that, and that's in the book, is Tertullian, who I had to have to go back and look at what century that was, but it was a long time ago. Augustine, all the way up through 14th, 15th century clergy, clear up to Dobson and Donald Trump, and it's it's all along, but it started a long time ago. And I think this is one of the things that I am constantly wanting to assert. Again, when we look at these biblical texts, it's very difficult for any of us to read these stories without being profoundly influenced by the way they've been told. Not the story itself, but the interpretation and the telling, which isn't even in the text. But we read into it immediately because we have these tellings from way back in like the 4th century forward, that have already started to interpret what Eve did and why, and what the impact of that was. And so this is the point that I'm always making, is that even if we grew up never having heard her story at all, we still live in a culture, especially in the Western world, that from the beginning of its origin has been shaped by a religious belief that women are dangerous, that they can't be trusted. And so it's in the water. It's just Yeah. So no, I don't know that there was probably one original person who began to think about this, but it was like a rushing stream from that point forward.
And Carla talked about that in her podcast, with her episode on Lilith, and I don't remember what the time period was, but the mythology that Lilith would come, and because to spill their seed was a sin, so they were taught that Lilith would come in as a demon, would come in the middle of the night and steal their seed, and that was their explanation for nocturnal ejaculation, and thereby not giving the men responsibility for anything at all. It was their fault. It was the woman's fault. But so from the beginning of time, essentially, men have been, well, at least from the beginning of religion, men have been taught to fear beautiful, powerful, independent women. And that is something that is woven into our fabric. And I mean, and I do have firsthand experience of that, because so I'm a lesbian, obviously. Again, if you watch my content at all, can't not know that, right? And so I grew up in a Catholic home, but my parents are very liberal. And even the Catholic church that they took us to wasn't particularly strict, but I went to catechism, I went to CCD. And even though I didn't get the message in my home that homosexuality was wrong, it was still, I still had that because it was in the church, and it was in the media, and it was a subtle message, but the message was still there because I wasn't represented anywhere.
Exactly.
right? So I
Exactly.
still got the message that it was wrong, even though the message wasn't coming from inside my house.
Mm-hmm. No
So,
question. Yeah.
um, and the other thing about Eve is that, the mythology of the snake goes with that too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we often were like, no, the snake really isn't an evil thing. And prior to Christianity, there were snake cults, and the snake was
Oh, yeah.
an object of knowledge and
Yeah, it's a
power.
symbol
And
for
there are
wisdom. Yeah.
there are snake goddesses that
Mm-hmm.
precede Christianity.
For
So
sure. Yeah, it's the symbol for wisdom.
right,
And when you look back at textual interpretation, or when you look at scholastic work that is trying to show the way in which the Hebrew scriptures were influenced by the culture at the time, we have Greek and Roman myths, and we have archetypes, and we have all kinds of other stories that would have been incorporated into this story because it's where the people lived.
right,
So it's one of the questions we have to ask is, when they first heard that story, did they think of the snake the way that we've been told? Or did they think of the snake as wisdom? Did they
right,
think of Eve as a goddess because that would have been inherent in the culture? Or
right,
did they think of her the way that we learned to talk of her by about certainly by the 18th, 19th, 20th century? That's all we've ever done. So there's lots of questions that we have room to ask if we can pull our grip away from these dogmatic, narrow,
right,
doctrinal ways that the story's been primarily told in the last couple hundred years.
right. I mean, it would make sense to me that they initially thought of Eve as a goddess, but then set out to take away her power as they did with so many other
Mm-hmm.
goddesses, right?
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Um, yes, because they really did. They took power from so many, and there were so many goddesses that came from other cultures. Like we are so in the modern Western world, we forget that there is mythology other than the Greco-Roman
Yeah.
Olympian
Mm-hmm.
pantheon. You know what I mean? There's other
Mm-hmm.
mythology in the world. There are other people in the world, right?
Shocker. Yeah, exactly.
There are Hindu goddesses, and there are Asian
Yeah.
goddesses, and there are African goddesses, and there are Turkish goddesses and Slavic
Mm-hmm.
goddesses, and I mean, there is
Exactly.
other mythology.
Yeah. That
And
far
some of that
predates.
mythology moved to Greece and that area of the
Yep.
world. And
For
yeah,
sure. For sure. And it's all, I mean, it's so interesting to go in and read scholars who have looked at that exactly, right? Looked
right,
at what those influences were at the time. And we've just basically erased them not out of the text, because the text is the text, but the way that we've
right,
told the story,
right,
we've eliminated that. And it shows up in little tiny ways. It's kind of like Easter eggs, in games.
right,
um, it shows up. And I think for me, as much as I have been tempted over the years to just, again, throw the baby out with the bathwater, to just walk away from all of it, there's a part of me that is always astonished that many of these stories of women even survived, because a
right.
lot of them, not a lot, a number of them make men look really bad.
Yeah,
There are stories in the New Testament, for example, one in particular that makes Jesus look really bad, and which I'm fine with. I think that allows us humanity, and divinity doesn't have to be some perfect, all-encompassing, inviolate sort of idea. But the fact that those stories survived, given all the times they've been copied and told audibly before they were ever written down, and then
right,
transcribed. To me, I think if there was ever something that would help me actually believe in the divine or believe in the power of the sacred feminine, it's the fact that those stories even exist.
right.
They could have been so easily erased. And I'm sure thousands of them have been, but the fact that we still have some is miraculous.
Right.
And they deserve to be told in ways that are redemptive and empowering and healing and beautiful.
So do you think it's helpful to look at these alleged scriptures that were discovered later? Like I
Mm.
was reading last week about, what is it? No, I can't remember. The Essene, is it the Essene Gospel of Peace that is allegedly the recording of the actual words of Jesus? Do you know what that is?
Mm. I haven't heard of that one.
I
Yeah.
think that's what it's called. Um,
No, I think we totally like those extra biblical, it's called extra biblical sources, right? Things that came out like the
like
Gospel of Mary
yeah,
or and any of these texts that were later discovered, or not even later discovered, but there were a whole bunch of texts when the Council of Nicene met to do a whole bunch, even them that we knew about, that were
right,
left out because
right.
they couldn't make the case for how they told the larger story, held to the doctrine that mattered. All kinds of decisions were being made by men
Which
back then.
I don't know if I buy that. You know what I mean? I think,
Mm-hmm.
of
Yeah, we
course
would
the
want all of them,
Gospel of
wouldn't we?
Mary
Like,
was left
yeah,
out. I mean,
yeah, give us all of them so that we
right,
get
and let us
to choose.
decide.
Exactly.
Well, and we also don't take into account that some things, I mean, we forget that things were written from the viewpoint of men, and not only are things interpreted by men, but things are interpreted by translators too,
Of course
because
they are.
sometimes translators have a choice between two or three words in a different
Mm-hmm.
language, and they
Yeah,
make
this is,
their own judgment call of
mm-hmm.
which word to use, which makes a
Yeah.
difference.
Yeah, this was really huge in my own like deconstruction, my own movement of what I believed and didn't believe. When I was in seminary, I took both Greek and Hebrew. And in Hebrew, the Hebrew class, which is the language of the Old Testament, there were only two women in the class and all the rest were men, and the professor was a man. And we were translating the book of Ruth, which is very short in the Old Testament. And so every day in class, we would have to come in with having already done the translation from Hebrew to English of a chapter, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And we'd been doing this for maybe, I don't know, 3 weeks, 2 weeks, something like that. And I started to notice that the other woman and myself consistently translated the story differently, the actual words, the text differently than the men. And they would argue. They would say, that's not how it goes. Like, you don't, that's not right. And both Carissa and I would say, you can look at how we parsed the verbs, how we broke it down, how we assigned subject object. Like, you can see what we did.
Right.
And it wasn't wrong. It was just, so what I started to notice was naturally, the two of us came at this text from a different perspective, didn't do anything in error, but it subtly started to change the tone of some
Right.
aspects of the story. And that was really significant to me because, again, we have this belief, often if we've grown up in the church, that there's only one way to tell these stories, that the text is always right, that
Right.
there's nothing to argue with or about. And what we forget is exactly the point that you're making, is that even the translators, if they left off one little mark, it changes the
Right.
way that word is interpreted. And certainly when you think about how old these documents are and how many hands they've exchanged over time, it's
Right.
super easy for some of these little punctuation marks in Hebrew to be left off or to be added in. And it can completely change who the subject of that sentence is, or who the
Right.
person's speaking to, or who is actually speaking. And that was really radical and revolutionary for me to start to recognize that what I had learned, memorized, known inside out, upside down, and backwards throughout my youth and early adulthood might just be something else. What? What? That just opened up all kinds of worlds of possibility for me that
Right.
was hugely significant and
Yeah, I
continues to
mean,
be.
people don't know that, especially today's generation. I mean, they, you know, today's generation, they speak in text. They don't even use punctuation. You know what I mean? It's,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, that's
I
not a
do know.
slime against young people. Well, I guess it is.
Yeah.
So I looked it up while you were talking. So it's the Essene, Essene, Gospel of Peace. That's what I was
Okay,
looking
I'll
at
look
the
for
other
that.
day. And it's allegedly just kind of a record of words that God actually said. And I was looking at that because he allegedly spoke about the earthly mother,
Mm.
um, and speaks of a goddess as a mother, as the kind of about Gaia, right? He speaks about the Earth Mother. So
Nice. Nice.
anyway, that
I'll
was
look for that.
interesting. I don't know if it's true or not. I would like to believe that it's true that he
It's
spoke of
all
an Earth
relative. I
Mother.
think if it is for you, then it is enough.
Sometimes I feel that way, right? Like even if it's not true, I believe it, and that's what
Yep.
matters to me.
Yep.
In some contexts, in other contexts, like that doesn't fly, right? But in this context, I think it does.
Gravity.
Um,
Yeah, I get it. There are some things that seem kind of
right,
irrefutable.
right, right. Yeah, like some things with my wife, I can't say, well, I believe it, so
Yeah, I
can't win
get
an
it.
argument that way.
Yeah.
Um, so how do we, yeah, what are the other steps that we can take to, because I do feel like I don't know. I mean, I feel like from my realm of like trying to shine a light on, because I live in the Midwest, which is Christian country,
Yeah.
right? And I come into contact with people daily who really do, like, without question, take the Bible as like, this is how it is.
Mm-hmm.
And they really believe still
Mm-hmm.
that the Bible was written by God, and you know what I mean? Like
I
there is a
do.
big swath of this country
Mm-hmm.
that still believes that. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
although I am usually an optimistic person, it is hard to be an optimistic person living here.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you. You know, it's interesting. Like I would probably, I'm trying to think if this is the sentence I'm going to say is actually what I believe. Um, and I think I do. Um, I don't have any problem with people actually reading the Bible, believing that it's true. Like, okay, like I can read any book and find meaning in it as I
Right,
choose,
right,
right? So I don't have any resistance to that. What I actually would prefer or hope is that we would actually read it instead of reading into it, that we would actually
right,
let ourselves imagine what's between the lines of these stories and what the overarching narrative might have to tell us instead of defaulting to what we've been told the story means. And it's
right,
really hard for people who've grown up in the church to pull those two apart from one another. And it was hard for me. Like it felt really counterintuitive. It felt dangerous. I mean, I had grown up, I grew up my whole life going to church every single Sunday. I went to a Christian college. I was a missionary in Korea. I married a pastor. Like there were, like it was really unsettling for me to begin to consider that maybe there were some other ways to think about this. But once
right,
I did, and these kind of this house of cards started to fall down,
right,
then it didn't feel scary to me anymore. Then it felt like, well, this is like open season. Now I can just imagine and create something that feels whole and
right,
like
right,
I'm seen, or I'm actually valued and worthy and not ignored or shamed or silenced. Um, so my point in that is, yes, the Midwest. I mean, I live in the South. Like I'm clear
right,
on what
right,
the predominant mind frame is of most of the people that are driving around in cars next to me on a daily
right,
basis,
right,
and how they're voting, and all of which I
right,
disagree with.
right.
Um, uh, so I just think, when I think about my book, for example, I think, I hope that it really speaks to women like you, for example, who have already done the work of leaving behind Catholicism, choosing the goddess, or choosing forms of faith and belief and divinity and self-worth and all of those things on your own. You've done that work. I
Right.
also hope that it speaks to women who are still in it
Right.
and need permission, need ways to start to understand these stories in a different way, to just be given permission.
Right.
Um,
And I
and
think I'm sorry, I didn't mean to
no,
interrupt
no,
you.
all good.
Um, and I think that's happening, and I think part of
Mm-hmm.
that is seeing more, I guess, popularity, for lack of a different word, in more casual Christian churches,
Yeah.
like the Unitarian churches, and you know what I mean? More and more
Mm-hmm.
people are leaving strict churches like
Yes.
Catholicism in droves,
Yes.
and filling up churches like Unitarian churches and Methodist churches that are a
Mm-hmm.
little more
Mm-hmm.
casual or
Mm-hmm.
lax
More
about
liberal for
things.
sure. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
coming more and more to more liberal churches. But um sometimes they stray. My experience of that is that sometimes they stray too far from a spiritual message and
Mm-hmm.
focus too much on, like, so in May, I'm starting this Sunday morning message thing, which is a very spiritual thing. And I'm doing that because I wanted that and couldn't find it. So, in my experience, if I have a need that isn't being met, either it's a need that I don't really need met, right? And the goddess will kind of tap me on the shoulder and say, you don't really need that. Or it's a need that I see in my community of goddess worshipers and people who follow a goddess path. And then I try and fill that need. So I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to start this series on Sunday morning. And, but when I had that need, I was looking on YouTube for something to fill that need. So I listened to Sunday morning Unitarian, like Sunday morning sermons. And because social justice is so woven into their fabric, all the Sunday morning services were about that. And I was like, okay, I get that that's what your church is all about, but that wasn't what I was looking for.
Mm-hmm.
I actually wanted what I had in Catholic Church when I was young, because
Mm-hmm.
we had kind of liberal priests, and I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be moved, and I wanted somebody to tell me a story or a parable or even a historical fact and give me the moral lesson of the story, and talk to me about
Mm-hmm.
spiritual things.
Yeah, I
That's what
think
I was
that's
looking for.
really, I think that's really something that those of us who've grown up in the church, and even those who don't, I think there's a hunger, even if we leave it, for ritual, for liturgy, for
Yes.
rhythms, for community, for application that feels at a soul level as though
Right.
it's impacting me. Now, I'm all for social justice, more,
Right,
please,
right,
right?
right.
Like we need all that. And I want my own compulsion or motivation for social justice to come from a core of myself that is
Right.
committed to equality and love and inclusion and grace, right? Like, and those things don't come only because we're talking about social justice. Those things
Right.
come through spiritual practices. And so I was listening to a podcast just the other day that was talking about the demise of church, especially post COVID, right? How for 2 years
Right.
nobody attended. And now, so there's a whole group of people who said, I'm never going back. And there's another group of people who said, I can hardly wait to get back.
Right.
But more who've just not returned. And so I wonder about what the kind of collapse or gap is as we've moved further and further from these forms of organized religion. How do we continue to meet this innate need within us as humans to be connected to each
Right.
other, but also to
Right.
our own souls? And for me, one of the ways that I have been able to sustain that, even though I've left the church and left the religion that I grew up with, is through these stories of women.
Right.
You know, I can look at the story of Eve or the story of Hagar or the story of Queen Esther as examples, and I can find aspects of that story that feel to me like deeply significant and spiritual truths that are mine to incorporate.
Right.
And I can
Right.
see, I don't have to think about the God or the men or the patriarchy or the misogyny that's been woven into those texts.
Right.
I
Right.
can pull those women out separately and
Right.
find so much that feeds my soul in their
Right.
stories. And that's what I think we need and want,
Right.
and desire and deserve.
Right. Right. And there are a lot of women out there, I now know, right? I mean, that's been part of the gift of doing this podcast, is now being in contact with and having access to a lot of very spiritual women. So I can, and I frequently do, you know, I will put my earbuds in and listen to, you know, like video clips or talks from Flora Ware or Abigail Mensah-Bonsu, or, you know, any of these women that I've had on the show, and that feeds my spirit. You know, or I will listen to, like what I did this morning. I was listening to like old talks by Maria Gimbutas. You know what I mean? Like that feeds my soul, you know what I mean? Because she had all of this proof of, you know, this ancient goddess world and proof of the primordial goddess and all of that. And that makes me happy, right? When I listen to proof of like what I believe that's actually true, that makes me happy, and
Of
that
course,
that
it's so
feeds my soul.
validating.
So,
Yeah.
you know, so I hope that this Sunday morning series will give that to other people, because
Mm-hmm.
I you know, that's the assumption that I make as a priestess who tries to serve her community. If it's
Mm-hmm.
something that I feel is lacking, I assume that other people are looking for that too.
Yeah,
You know what I
I would agree
mean?
with you. Yeah.
But I think that you're right. I think that it's lacking, that
Mm-hmm.
if we leave the church but we still want to be spiritually fed, if we don't have churches of the goddess, where are we going?
Yeah, exactly.
Where are we going?
Mm-hmm.
And can we
Yeah,
have a church of the goddess? That would be fucking amazing. But what does that look like? And
yeah.
who's gonna pick up that torch? Because I got to tell you, it can't be me. I'm busy. I already have a full plate. It's got to be somebody else, or maybe
Yeah.
it will be me. I don't know. I don't know what the plan is. She'll
Mm-hmm.
tell me.
I'm sure you're right. That's awesome. That's awesome.
Okay. So, do you see the Church of the Goddess as a possibility? I mean, is there scripture out there for that? I mean, to start a religion, you've got to have either discovered scripture or a prophet or a lineage. That's my understanding of how a religion starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, Kelly. Like I would say first that I think that those churches, not as traditional as we might think about them, but those communities already exist. I think we
Yes.
see certainly in the online world example after example after example of groups of women that are gathering to learn about the goddesses, to have a deeper understanding of a theology that isn't patriarchal or misogynistic, to be curious about other ways in which we can express our own spirituality, our own understanding of the divine, the sacred feminine within, like all of those things. It's everywhere in ways that it certainly wasn't a decade or two ago.
Right.
But I think it's always been there. You know,
Yes.
even if it hasn't been the predominant voice that we hear or the churches that we drive past, you know, on our way to the grocery store, it's always existed. This worship
and it
of
used to be just the witches and the pagans.
yes,
Now it's spread beyond that.
for sure, for sure. So I do think that there's certainly opportunity for more, quote unquote, I guess, formal structures or organizations, institutions, even that could be created on behalf of a spirituality that is distinct to the goddess, as example, or the divine feminine, or however we want to think about this. And as you know, there are plenty of texts that you can go to, that you can work from. There are plenty of prophets who have lots to say about this, and definitely there's lineage. It's just that it's been underground, or it's been ostracized or marginalized or killed off or attempted to be like, but all of those things exist. And I think it's just a matter of discerning for ourselves, what feeds me? What do I most need right now? What do I want? Where is it available? How do I find it? And then living through the complexity of being in community with other people who sometimes we love and other times make us crazy.
Right. I feel like I need a church, but I discovered yesterday that a master's in divinity is just as expensive as any other master's degree. So
Indeed.
I do not see that in my immediate future.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, when I went to get my MDiv, my Master of Divinity degree, I started that program. What was I would have just turned 40, I think, when I started it. Most of the students were in their 20s. Mm-hmm. And I had no intention. I mean, an MDiv is what you get in order to be ordained, right? To like allow you to. And I had no interest in that whatsoever. At the time, I was still married to a pastor, and one of them in our house was more than enough. Right. But I was super clear that I didn't want that I was studying it because I wanted to learn, because it was a matter that I was just really intrigued by. And I never saw it going the direction that it did. Like, you would never have been able to tell me at the beginning of the program that by the end of it, I would be completely ensconced in feminist theology and leaving my marriage and leaving the church and thinking about my whole world in much different ways.
Right. I mean, I did the, fill out the form, pay $50 and get ordained online. I did do that. So I am ordained. And you know what? When I did that, I didn't know why I was doing it, and I didn't know what I was going to do with it. That was one of those divinely inspired ideas. And when I say that, I mean, when you have an inspired idea and it didn't come from you, right? When you have a thought that just pops in your head and you know that it didn't come from you. I don't know how else to describe that. That was one of those. Said, get ordained. I said, all right, got ordained. Okay. So now I have the little name tag and the little business card. But that then led to this idea of the Sunday morning talk. And we'll see how that goes. So I don't know. I don't know where that's going, But
it feels like even what you're describing there, Kelly, is what, at least from my perspective, feels so important. Like, how do we let go of understandings? Let's use ordination as an example. How do I let go of the old understanding of ordination? How do I believe that I have permission and authority to be able to sit in that role? What does that invite? What does that require? These are questions that traditionally women have not asked. Right. Now, certainly over the last many years, they have, and some have been given yeses and many have been given nos. But overarchingly, this world that we live in doesn't automatically say to a woman, of course you should lead us spiritually. Of course you should step into a place of power, voice, and wisdom.
Because what winds up happening, is then I suffer from this imposter syndrome, right? Of course. Sure. That's why I looked into the Master of Divinity, not because I really want to go back to school again. I already have a master's degree in something else, but because I feel like, who am I to take on a spiritual
Mm-hmm.
leadership role?
Mm-hmm. And this would be the case I'm making in the book, right? Who
Right,
are you? Well, you are the daughter, the lineage, the kin of Eve, of Hagar, of Jael, of Esther, of Vashti. Like, this is who you actually are. And
right,
these are the stories. We've not heard the stories in a way that we feel as though they're the shoulders on which we stand, that they're
right,
the pillars of who our own matrilineal line. Like, we've not
right.
been given those stories in that way. And so, of course, we wander around and wonder if we are allowed, if we have authority, which is, of course, all patriarchy and misogyny,
Right.
when all of it's just a lie from the pit of hell. Like,
Right.
we have these stories and this legacy
Right.
history, if we choose to see it, that says again and again, stand up, rise up, speak the wisdom that's yours, trust your own heart, be curious, go where you wish, say what you want. Like, that's what these stories actually offer us,
Yeah. Yeah.
if we can see them that way, which then changes how we live, which is the
Right.
most
Right.
spiritual thing we can do.
Right. Um, so what else needs to be rewritten besides Eve? I mean, we know we need to rewrite Lilith. We know we need to rewrite
Mm-hmm.
Mary Magdalene. We know we need
Well,
to rewrite
I'd make the case that all of them need to be rewritten.
all of them need
Uh,
to be rewritten.
and I would even say that the stories that, I mean, again, if you look at the canon of scripture, there are not that many stories of women. But if we look at the canon as a whole, all of the texts that we do have, all of them deserve to be rewritten
Right.
through a different lens. All of them just, I mean, even like you were talking, you started our conversation today telling me about the song, the Jericho, right? And then
Right.
she's
Right.
rewritten this story of Jericho in order to be a lesbian love story. Awesome. That is not a story about women. It's a
Right.
story
Right.
about souls who march around a wall and blow their horns until it falls down. And somehow her lens of interpreting that story has offered something completely different. So for me,
Right,
it's
because
like,
the refrain in the song is if you'll be my Joshua, I will be your Jericho. And when the
mm,
walls come crumbling down, we'll build a shelter of our own. Yeah, it's a
that's
great
beautiful.
song. I'll send it to you. I'll send you a link so you can listen to it. It's a beautiful song.
That's awesome.
And I was thinking
Yeah.
about how
So
women
there's the point, right?
I was thinking we should let gay men rewrite the Sodom and Gomorrah story, right?
Yeah.
Because
I
that's
mean,
what haunts
to
them.
me, there's no, there, yeah. I mean, I feel like all bets are off. Like, take any story you want. Like, it doesn't, they're not sacrosanct. They're
Right,
stories. So take any of them. And it is not an attempt to mangle or malign the tradition that through which the story's been told. Like, I get why the stories have been told by men and written by men, and I understand that it's
right,
historic. Like, I don't have any argument with that. Okay,
right,
that's where we are. But I could actually take any of them and just wonder without doing damage or harming something. If you
right,
think about the stories of, like, these mythic stories, we don't hold, like, Greek and Roman myths as example. We don't have this same adamant demand that they only be told one way over and over and over again.
right,
We don't think about them that way. We tell them in fantastical ways. We tell them in simplistic ways. We tell them in poetry. We tell them in song. We tell them in dream and metaphor. We talk about how the archetype of whoever, it doesn't matter. Who's the hearth, the woman of the hearth? Doesn't matter. We could pick any of them: Isis, Medusa, any of
right,
them,
right,
and think about how many ways you've heard those stories told.
right,
Like, it's not one narrative that
right.
we have.
Like the hero's journey.
Yes,
Right,
exactly. But for some reason, when it comes to the Christian text, the Hebrew scripture, like, whether it's Christian or not, like
There's only one way.
the Judeo-Christian text, we have this belief that there's really just one way. And if you get it wrong, that's bad. If you
Right.
ignore it, that's bad. If you try to reinterpret it, who are you? And I'm like, why are these different from any other stories that we tell?
Right.
And you know, I think
Because they think they're not just stories. That's why.
I agree. I agree.
That's why.
But they are. That's my
I
point.
know that, and you know
Yeah.
that.
Yes.
They don't know
Yeah.
that, or they
Yeah.
don't believe that.
Yeah. So there's
something baked into the cake that
yeah.
I don't know, man. It's so insidious.
Well, it's
It really is. It's
Yeah.
insidious.
Yeah, it is. It is. And it's, I will say, I mean, I started, again, it was over 20 years ago that I got my MDiv. I'm 62 now. You know, I've seen so much movement over the years in terms of people's capacity to understand theology differently. People, like, let me use my mother as an example. Like 20 years ago, the conversations that she and I were having about me rewriting these stories are radically different than the conversations she and I are having today. And she's in her late 80s. She can talk to me about her own beliefs, what she's let go of, what she's questioning, what she's wondering about now that 20 years ago she couldn't do, nor could I. I was in a different place at the time. So culturally, I think that we continue to see evolution and movement in this regard. But I will say, where we see these pockets of, well, not pockets, where we see too much of our nation lost in these really conservative spaces, the compassionate part of me, when I can be, I can't all the time, but when I can be compassionate toward conservatism, what I know is that any change of that nature feels so fearful. What do you mean there's not a rule book? What do you mean there's not a right and wrong? What do you mean not a black and white? To have to be in a place of gray and ambivalence and without absolutes for many people is just way too scary to even consider.
Right.
And I get that. That's part of our evolution as individuals,
right.
as a culture. So I mean, I think we're getting there. I just think it's really slow, and we have a whole bunch of steps backwards, a la the overturning of Roe v. Wade and stuff going on with transgender kids and you know, like we all, I mean, it feels like we're going backwards, which I wouldn't disagree with, and we're moving forward at the same time. That we do see change and movement. Thankfully.
I'm not particularly hopeful. I'm not.
Yeah.
I've been convinced for some time that she's ready to wipe us off the board and start over.
Yeah.
Because for all we know, we're like version 8,976.0 human.
Yeah, it's possible.
Right?
Yeah.
And she wipes us off the board and starts over and, you know, and reviews and says, okay.
Yeah.
Wealth, probably not. Wage gap, wealth, not a good idea. We're not going to do that this time.
Yeah.
You know, commerce, maybe not such a good idea. Let's not do that this time. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
But I also believe that we're right on track. You know what I mean? Like everything is in divine timing. I think when people say everything happens for a reason, what that really means is that, yes, that's true, but it's probably a reason that is beyond our understanding. It's not a reason we're going to know in this lifetime. That the picture is bigger and broader than us.
Yes.
So, of course, bad things happen that we don't understand. Tragedy happens, life happens. We have death and illness and all of those things. But it is for a reason. And we'll be back. That's my belief. Life is that we are eternal. And I posted something the other day about injustice, this experience that I had in my very small town that's got a wealth gap and is divided between, you know, the north side of town and the south side of town. And I experienced the difference of that in a 10-minute span and some errands I had to run. And I told the younger generation, I said, you got to fix this shit because I'm coming back and I want it to be better when I get here. Because
Yeah.
I turned 50 last year and my birthday's actually tomorrow. I'll be 51.
Mm.
And and I have some health problems. So I feel like I'm in the last chapter and I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. Um, but yeah, I will do what I can to make it better while I'm still here. But beyond a certain point, I'm like, yeah, I can't get involved with that now. It's too late for me. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
I can't pick up a new cause.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I talked to like my niece and nephew, and I'm like, you got to work on this so that when I come back, it's better.
Yeah. May it be so. May it be so.
Okay, so well, we've reached about the top of the hour. Um, so if you've listened to an episode, oh, but is that the only episode you listened to? Was the one on
No,
Stephen Lillis?
I listened to a couple of others.
Okay, so then you
Yeah.
know that I'm going to ask you three questions,
Yes, I'm
and
ready.
you're okay. So you've listened to episodes, so you're ready. Okay, it's not really fair that you're ready,
This
but
is the
okay,
problem with having a podcast that people can listen to. So
right, right.
yeah.
Okay, so question one. Tell me something about yourself that people who know you would be surprised to learn.
All right. I'm slightly embarrassed to admit this, but
All right.
I absolutely love American Idol, and I
Okay.
cry through almost every single episode.
I am shocked to learn that about you.
I
Is that
can't help it. I
is
can't
that
help it.
also
Especially when
your
they
is
flash
that
to the
also
they splash to the parents watching their kids sing, and then I'm just like a total basket case. I just find it so inspiring.
okay? Yeah, I would not guess that about you at all. You seem so much more sophisticated than American
I
Idol.
there you go. Sorry.
Okay. Question two. Current favorite TV, is that your current favorite TV series? Is that also the answer
No,
to question two?
no. The one that I'm completely obsessed with right now is this series on Netflix called Criminal, and
Okay.
it's Criminal UK, Criminal Spain, Criminal Germany,
I've seen
Criminal
that.
France.
Yes.
So good.
Very well acted. We haven't seen them all. I think we saw the one in the UK and the one in France.
Yeah, so good.
Okay.
So
And
yeah,
very
love it.
smart, very well written,
Yeah,
and
so in,
obviously very knowledgeable about the laws in that particular country.
yeah. The other
Right?
thing that's interesting is that no matter which country you're watching, the scene, the setting is exactly the same. They're in the same building,
Yes.
same. It's the same, no matter what. It's the same, which
Yes.
I cinematically, I found really interesting.
Yes. Yes. Boy, that is a far cry from American Idol.
It is.
Right? Those are really two ends of the spectrum there you've got going on.
That's just how complicated and diverse I am, Kelly.
Right? Keeping the mystery alive there.
That's right.
Okay, and finally, if your life were a movie, what would be the theme song on the soundtrack of your life?
Yeah. This one is harder because I love movies and I love thinking about soundtracks. I love music. I love all of that. But what I came to is this song by India Ari called I Am Light. And it sounds a lot like a hymn. Like if you listen to it, she'll repeat the same words again and again and again. But there are lines in there where she says, I'm not the things my family did. I'm not the voices in my head. I'm not the pieces of brokenness inside. I am light. I'm not the skin on the outside. I'm not my age. I'm not my race. I'm light. And then at the very end, she says, I am divinely defined. I am the God on the inside. I am a star, a piece of it all. I am light. And that would be my hope for me and for all of us.
Very nice. Very nice. All right. Well, thank you very much for being with me this morning. I always hope to have guests on more than once. I am hoping that down the road I have some panel discussions with 2 or 3 guests at a time, especially I think I'm going to have a few episodes where we talk about this. How do we bridge the gap between academic knowledge and your average spiritual seeker who really only has access to the internet, and there's so much misinformation out there, and a lot of academic research is behind the paywall, usually things like, like JSTOR and Wiley and, any recent journal articles they don't have access to. And a lot of spiritual information, again, is questionable, whether it's coming from a reputable source or not.
Yeah. I think those are going to be interesting conversations.
Yes. But I really look forward to reading your book.
Thank you. And
I think I will learn a lot, because I can tell you that overcoming those messages took a very long time.
And it's ongoing.
It is ongoing. And the one that took the longest to shed, I should have said this earlier, the one that took the longest to shed was the idea of a God that worked on a system of punishment and reward. That was the hardest one.
I write a lot about. Yeah, I write a lot about, and it certainly has been my own journey, to be sure, to ongoing, to purge that. Like, it's so easy to slip back into not being good enough, or if only I tried harder or was better, then I'd be deserving of X, Y, and Z. And I don't believe any of that.
Right.
And I say to my clients all the time, like, people, I hear them say, I don't believe that. I'm like, I know you don't believe it, but it doesn't mean it isn't still functioning in your psyche or in the culture around you. So we can hear ourselves say the words of what we do not believe anymore. Like, maybe I do not believe in the virgin birth of Jesus. Maybe I do not believe in the resurrection. Maybe I do not believe that the world was created in 7 days. Maybe I do, right? Like, I don't believe these things logically, but that doesn't mean that they aren't still inherent in us emotionally and psychologically and culturally. And so it's a lot of work for us to constantly be untwisting these threads of stories from our own story to be able to craft the one we want, the one that we've intentionally chosen, the one that feels in integrity and in alignment with what we do actually believe and care about. And it's not a quick process. It's one of a lifetime, I believe.
So I think I'll record another episode with you, and we're going to call it The Unraveling.
I'd love that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. We'll talk about that.
Awesome.
Okay. Well, again, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah.
I will speak with you soon. I look forward to reading your book. I'm going to end very abruptly. I'm going to close the meeting. So, you know how it is. The screen's just going to go blank. But until then, may the peace and the love of the goddess be with you.
Thank you. And also with you.
Okay.
All right, Kelly, thanks.
I'll be in touch.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thanks for watching The Girlfriend God on YouTube. If you enjoy this podcast, the best way you can support it is to like it, follow it, leave comments on the page, rate it, review it, share it with your friends. But most of all, subscribe to this channel. And if you want more of The Girlfriend God, you can find The Girlfriend God on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Thanks again for watching.